Hello, everybody. Welcome to this British Association of Oral Surgeons bite-size event. I'm Paul Coulthard, President of BAOS. This evening, I'm truly delighted to be in conversation with Baroness Helena Kennedy QC. The area of discussion is inequalities in oral surgery, the role of the oral surgeon and the dental team in responding to domestic violence and abuse, and a little about COVID-19. We're having a broad discussion around society, our profession, and our specialty. There'll be an opportunity for questions, so please use the chat function, and Rhiann Jones, our BAOS Council member, is going to ask questions on your behalf at the conclusion. Baroness Kennedy is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers and an internationally renowned human rights champion. She is a Scottish barrister and broadcaster, and was elevated to the House of Lords in 1997, where she is a Labour peer. Baroness Kennedy is a regular broadcaster, journalist, and lecturer. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have the least power in the system, promoting civil liberties and human rights. Baroness Kennedy is currently Director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She is one of 9 individuals who has recently had sanctions imposed on her by the Chinese government in view of her stand on human rights. Baroness Kennedy served as Principal of Mansfield College, Oxford from 2011 to 18 and is now Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. Of particular relevance this evening, Baroness Kennedy has chaired an independent review of diversity and inclusion for the Royal College of Surgeons of England, and the report has just been published. She is also spearheading 2 amendments to the Domestic Abuse Bill before the House of Lords. And there are so many more roles and accomplishments. Welcome, Baroness Kennedy. You're extremely busy, so thank you for sharing some of your very precious time with us. I know you were born in Glasgow and you live in London, and you clearly have a passion to reshape the world. Where did that come from? Is it your childhood family experience, or was that developed at the bar or later?
Well, I can't say that it started in my childhood because we were not a particularly well-traveled family. And I don't know that I had ever been on an airplane until I was in my late teens. But I did certainly come from a family that had a very strong sense of our obligations to other people and to our community, but also beyond that. And certainly, I think that a lot of what I care about came from my parents. And then I, as a lawyer, I hadn't ever intended becoming, I had no idea of the trajectory. I came down to London to study law and then became a barrister and had a long career as a barrister. And I really did make a commitment to my work being in the field of civil liberties. At that time, that's what we talked about, was internally that creating and protecting the liberties of everybody within the United Kingdom. And as I became more experienced, I became a Queen's Counsel. I did a lot of very high profile big cases. And I wasn't at all inhibited about representing the underdog or those who were, if you like, not very popular with the public, but making sure they got a fair trial, believing that that was so vitally important. And then after I became a Queen's Counsel and was doing that sort of high level criminal work, I started doing it in the international domain. But I didn't start off thinking I'm going to be an international lawyer, I'm going to end up being the head of an Oxford college, or I'm going to end up in the House of Lords. Nothing was further from my mind, nor was it a possibility. But the thing I would say to everybody is, keep your options open always. You never know what might come along and what opportunities might arise.
Good advice. Okay, so let's talk about inequality, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm just curious as to where does discrimination come from? I mean, I know that, I understand that gender, other forms of discrimination are particularly prevalent in organisations that have got deeply forged hierarchies. And given that a lot of people listening are in the NHS, or especially surgery, which is very hierarchical, or in universities, as I am, I don't know, are those environments particularly different, or is discriminations there obviously everywhere? How does that happen?
Well, one could do a great anthropological study on why in societies why there is discrimination, and it all comes largely from the protection of the community, if you like, and the outsiders have to be kept out, especially if they might have hostile intent towards you. And so people grow up with people who are very much like themselves, and so there's often a sense of keeping it like that. And it's an instinctive human thing to keep, people appoint other people that are like themselves and therefore are more are less threatening and more clubbable and all of those things. And so what you find in, for example, the many old institutions within the United Kingdom is that which are, as you've just said, Paul, very hierarchical, and we like those things where you have presidents and then you have vice presidents and then you have councils and then you have committees and it goes all the way down the road, is that most of those institutions were peopled by men. And I always say this when I'm talking about law, is that, it wasn't some grand old conspiracy, we're going to keep women out, but it was just, that was how that power was in the hands of men. The people who made the rules who were the rule makers were men. And so often law hasn't delivered very well for women. And so I, from a very early stage, sort of saw that. And I started, even in my late 20s, writing about the ways in which women face discrimination, certainly within the bar, which was a very elitist profession, very full of very privileged, basically young men who came in and rose up through its ranks and became judges and then senior judges and right to the very top. And the absence of women was very stark to me. I entered the legal profession when there were only 6% women. And so I became very interested in how those things worked. How institutions somehow also made the great excuses as to why things were the way they were, and that it would all change, they said, as more women came in. It would just be an evolutionary process, and change would take place sort of, in the ordinary way of things, a bit like, any kind of evolution, that like fish growing feet, that women would get to be good enough to become judges. Well, it didn't happen. Yeah. And so we then started organizing a bit more. By the time I was in my 30s, we set up an association of women barristers. We started advocating very loudly to have greater opportunities for women to become Queen's Counsel, senior members of the bar. And it was much easier for me to be very vocal about these things because I really didn't have ambitions to become a judge, to tell you the truth. But I rather valued my independence as an independent lawyer. But I did feel that having diversity in the judiciary would provide us with better outcomes. And that's not to say that there aren't women we learn. All of us learn how to do things in the way that a profession expects of us. And so smart women, and I would count myself amongst them, can learn to do things the way the guys do them. But you're actually enriched by having people who also have other perspectives. And so you can actually, the discourse changes when you have difference rather than sameness. And it's very interesting because McKinsey, the great sort of, consultancy organization that's used by the corporate world and is full of very brilliant folk, they went to work on this business of diversity in the corporates and in the financial sector. And they said, and they actually came through with a report that said that, in fact, businesses that are diverse are more productive, produce far better financial, if you like, benefits benefits to everybody. The profit margins increase enormously. And it's because of the knowledge that comes with having difference, that people with knowledge of how immigrant communities, for example, buy and sell, and the commodities they're interested in, and the ways in which they can be reached as consumers and so on, which may be different from how other people are reached. The ways in which women buy, the sort of appeal that can be made to women. When you have women on boards, they introduce that sort of knowledge and information to the discussions, and you want them in the senior levels. And so that learning then has drizzled into other areas.
Yeah.
And now look at our politics. The arguments have now been made over the last 20 years that you have to have women in Parliament making laws, dealing with the general public, and that the general public want to see their society reflected in those who are in those positions. And so it feeds into then all of the professions. And so doing this report was, to console the surgeons who I sort of was quite tough on in saying, you really have to change. You cannot have the high levels of the Royal Colleges, people by men of one background, you just can't have a whole set of white older men running everything. Yeah. You've got to try and get some variety in there, and now's the time. And so, and that's, it's hard for people to hear that the place that they are.
What did you think when you were asked to do that work for the Royal College of Surgeons England? I mean, I don't know. I guess you expected there was going to be a problem there to solve. So I guess because why would it be different from elsewhere? I mean, surgery has moved on. There are more women. There is more diversity than there was. But certainly when I looked at the report just produced, I thought there's a lot to learn still. There's a long way to go, and our own specialty can learn a lot. And I was fascinated, but particularly one aspect. I wanted to go through some of the recommendations that I was really interested in. One of them, let me find it here, was about that the Royal College should commit itself to be inclusive, diverse organisation committed to fairness for the best outcomes for patients. So that's interesting. So I know in the judiciary, where you've done so much, there's more equitable outcome in that world. And so I was interested to think, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, this is all about, of course, the patient. That's what we're here for. So is that what you would expect? That if we get this right, then this will be better for patient outcomes?
Well, listen, the thing about organizations which are about professionalism is that one of their roles, it's not just a club, it's about maintaining professionalism, maintaining standards, making sure that that professionalism isn't diluted and interfered with by governments, by things that happen in the nature of progress. And so one of the things that one has to say is that if there are any sections of your professional body who feel undervalued, who feel that somehow they will not make the rise up the ladder, or they will not be listened to or heard and embraced in the organizations, you start undermining professionalism. And there's no doubt that it has an impact ultimately on what you're there for, which is to care. And that's what was so impressive about doing it, was that all of you who are in professions, dentistry, in medicine, you're in the surgical world, you're doing it because you actually do care about your patients. Yeah. And so you want the best outcomes. When people are feeling pretty depressed and wretched over their experiences, their daily experiences, then it does diminish the outcomes. Undoubtedly, teams don't work as well together. You don't, if people are not being valued within them. You see, one of the things that, and it comes as a sort of shocking revelation, is that you've got in surgery 13% are women, and so it's still low by comparison with other specialisms. Now, those surgeons, amongst those surgeons, there are, and not enough, there are Black women. And I'm using the word Black, meaning, West African, Afro-Caribbean, as distinct from Asian. There's a high number of people from South Asia, Indian, Pakistan, and so on, working in the National Health Service. But if we just for a minute talk about Black practicing surgeons who are women, their daily round is the experience of being considered to be a cleaner, a nurse, or some kind of auxiliary of some kind. And that's a constant thing. Now, a lot of it at the time, it comes from, just staff, patients will come in and will not know that and not expect that somebody treating them. They expect that a surgeon looks like a white man. Yeah. Like people expect a judge to look like a white man. Yeah. But if you are generally, even by your colleagues, not being given, being referred to specifically as here is your surgeon and then spoken to as doctor. But what the women described was being regularly referred to as Josie or Ruby or whatever by their first names, which didn't communicate to everybody. This actually is the doctor. This is the surgeon, and so the business, the attrition of that, where your very expertise is not being recognized, is kind of hard. And there are lots of what are called microaggressions, small things which on their own, would sound as if you just were being a bit chippy if you were irritated. But when it's happening all the time, it starts to be an undermining thing. Now, what we discovered was that a lot of that can be dealt with by just being more thoughtful about it. But there's other things that happen in the surgical world. I mean, the ways in which I'm afraid, even in the operating theatre, the conversations that take place, which can often have racist undertones or anti-gay undertones, or talking about sex in a way that it makes the women feel deeply uncomfortable, and a feeling of entitlement to do that. And so I do think some of those things people have to just think about because of what they do in the cost that is borne by them happening all the time. But I mean, listen, this was not a sort of one long grouse. It was also a paean of praise to people who are choosing to work in the caring professions, how they ought to be nurtured more, but also how they ought to be given recognition, and how the colleges have a vital role to play, as indeed the organizations like your own have, in having an embrace that makes people feel welcome, draws people in to the activities and so on, and actively does that, because people can often be diffident about joining in when they are not from the, if you like, the dominant group. And so it's just about ways in which our professions have to step up to the plate on this. Our world has changed, and our society has changed, and we want to get the maximum benefits out of all of that. And working together, we will. And I think that that's what the report ultimately says. It also is saying that, it's been a hard old time during COVID, where the burdens borne by the medical profession, the dentistry profession, the society as a whole has been through a hard time, and the medical world particularly. And so we've really got to make sure that in this process that we don't see a reduction in the things that have been the glue that holds all of that professionalism together.
Another thing that was picked up, which interested me, was around, just change basic things like reforming the way people get to be at the top of these establishments, like the Royal College of Surgeons. So reforming election processes and deciding who's going to be president and vice president and the like. And you're encouraging a more rapid, like 2 years, and let's see a more diverse hierarchy, starting at the top. So this can feed down. It seems totally sensible, just to try and drive it forward. Just look at those basic mechanisms that I know in our own organisation they can be left at the side there for quite some time. It requires a bit of an effort to get out the articles and brush them off and rethink things. But another thing is particularly about parents in surgery as well, which I found very interesting. Just pointing out how challenging it can be and stressful it can be for parents. For example, it's often interesting in dentistry. It's often said, general dental practice is a great choice for a woman, as opposed to a hospital career or a clinical academic career. I mean, shouldn't all of these options be flexible?
Yeah, and the same thing was always said, of course, about becoming a general practitioner for doctors. The same thing. I mean, listen, my mother wanted me to be a primary school teacher because she thought that it would be the most wonderful thing that you would have the summer holidays off with your children. When your children were at school, you'd be at school. And when your children were at home, you would be too. And so that was the ceiling of her ambition for me. But and indeed, two of my sisters became teachers and very good teachers too. But all I would say is that the world has changed in an interesting way. These issues around parenting now affect men as much as well, perhaps not as much, but seriously they affect men too, because a younger generation of men, and I talk about my sons and my son-in-law, is that they expect to be much more actively involved in parenting than perhaps previous generations were. And so the young women now want to have a career, and also our world has become so expensive. Living here in London, for example, to get on the ladder of having a home where you can have children is a very expensive business. And so two people end up working, and so the women are saying to their men folk, "You've got to share this with me." Yeah. And so the demands on them are very great, and the job, of course, is often not designed around accommodating that. And I think that we have the surgical profession certainly has to look at ways in which that can be more effectively accommodated.
Okay, I agree, and I think that that's changed for men as well. So effectively, we say that feminism is about justice for men as well as for women.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I know I want to just here give a bit of credit to you, Paul, because you and I got to know each other properly because of the work that we did together around domestic violence. And you are a man who is very alert to the ways in which we all kind of bear responsibilities for improving our societies and making them better. And one of the ways in which women's lives can be blighted is by domestic violence. And so the importance of professionals, for example, who work in the field of oral surgery, who are practitioner dentists, to be alert to the fact that one of the places where women display injury arising from domestic violence is in their faces. And they often end up with injuries to jaws, injuries to their teeth, injuries to the maxilla, into the eye socket, and so on. And of course, they'll come and they'll say, "I fell in the bathroom and I slid on the floor and I hit my face on the bath," or some such story. And traditionally, of course, they would give that story, and that's what the doctor or the dentist or whatever would write down. Even if somewhere in the back of their minds they thought, "This doesn't look to me as though it's credible," but who am I to question it? And the difficulty for me as a lawyer when I used to do these cases was that not surprisingly, a woman would give an account sometimes and would end up in court against her husband, and her account would be challenged, and they would insist on seeing her medical records, and of course there would be nothing there to corroborate in any way that she had anything other than an accident. And so it is helpful if at the very time professionals, whether in whatever profession we're in, if we are seeing something that we have concerns about, that we take the actions that you've described in the work that you've done around the papers that you've written on domestic violence.
I'm very passionate about it, and you've done so much more in that world than I have. I mean, DVA's firmly on the political and public agenda. In part to you, great things have been done. I feel like I've not done so well with my own profession. It's quite hard to try and persuade people that this is a role and responsibility of people in the dental profession and for the team, for oral surgeons, oral and maxillofacial surgeons, and others in healthcare generally. I don't know, does that surprise you? I wonder whether it's about training. I know you have a view about the police force, like police officers require training if they're going to be effective in this world of domestic violence and abuse, and how they can contribute to their response. I don't know whether it's the same issue for us. I think people go into our profession because they're empathetic people, they care about people. But I think there's just a gap there in the training perhaps that we have.
But I think the starting point in all of this, Paul, is that we've been brought up to feel that, you know, what happens in the private domain is should not be interfered with. You know, that people's private lives and so on, and what happens behind closed doors. You know, it's the old-fashioned Englishman's home is his castle,
Yes.
and what happens inside that there is now that we've had to in many ways breach the castle's moat, and we've had to go in and say there are some things that happen behind closed doors that are unacceptable, and that where we have a duty to speak out. And that happened particularly around the issue of child abuse, whether physical abuse of children, you know, causing children real damage, and the horrible cases that we all know about over the. I mean, but it's been happening forever and a day. But we've become much more accepting that this is an area where there's a duty to report. The same is true on sexual abuse of children. A duty to report. And one of the interesting things about this domestic abuse bill that's currently going through Parliament was that one of the amendments that was passed in the House of Lords was that there should be some training for all professionals who might end up having interfacing with the general public and might be able to deal with domestic abuse and might see it, and that they should feel obliged to report, or that there should be some training. It should be in some way included in the curriculum that if you see this, and you can do it very sensitively by speaking to the woman who might well deny it. What was it? No, you're telling me that, you know, if there's something you want to talk to me about, honestly, because this looked to me as though you've hit a blunt object and it's been, you know, or whatever.
Absolutely. And I think also, I think people need to understand what their role is in terms of identification and referral, rather than, which is what our paper together was about, encouraging us, particularly at the start of that pandemic, when we knew that there could be a lot more domestic violence happening. So I think that identification referral, I think if people understand that is their role, and they don't have to solve the issues.
No, of course not.
But then the other issue for me is this is just a very small part of the puzzle, because then in healthcare, all we're doing is helping the poor woman, or sometimes a man, who has suffered the consequence of domestic violence. I feel as though, but what about the perpetrator? What is going on that's going to stop society creating perpetrators?
Well, listen, a lot of work is now going on in relation to this, and I think there is an acceptance just now. I mean, there's all these debates going on about, for example, boys in schools, you know, at a very early age being exposed to such extensive pornographic imagery. I mean, you know, there's nothing surprising about adolescents being interested in having a look at naked women and finding out more about sex, because there's a moment happening in their lives where that's a natural process. But it's being fed with a level of imagery and pornography, which is so accessible on their mobile phones. And people who do teach will tell you that this goes on in their classrooms, where the boys are looking at each other's phones and then putting them in the face of the nerdy boy that they think hasn't seen this stuff, and also showing it to girls. And then, of course, their expectations of what sex is like. And it's not sex that is mutually consensual and all the things that we associate with good sex. And so often it's abusive. So, you know, young men are being exposed, and boys are being exposed to rather awful ideas of what women are there for. And so, you know, I think as parents, we have a responsibility to try and, you know, induce in our boys the idea that, you know, this actually is not how you make for a good life in your relationships with people. And I think that we have to try and get our men to be much more mindful of you know, of what is expected of decent masculinity. We've been spending a lot of time talking about, you know, in our society, talking about women and women's entitlement and women's rights and so on, and correct to do that. but now's the time to be talking about what does good masculinity look like. And of course, I think it looks like Paul Coulthard, but it looks like and society's full of good men. But in amongst them, there are men who feel insecure and who turn to their fists because it was what they grew up with, or what they see too often in some of the imagery that they receive. So I think we've got a job of work to do.
Yeah, isn't the amount of domestic violence and abuse, isn't that a reflection of those attitudes, those proper attitudes of a man and a woman? I mean, it's about gender inequalities, presumably, which is why you see difference in different societies when people don't have that equality that we're all working towards, and there's more domestic violence.
Well, the interesting thing, Paul, is that since my work became much more international, and I suppose it really started when I became the chair of the British Council, and I used to travel extensively around the world, and would often speak about law and about my work in the law, and about the nature of our societies and so on. And there wasn't a single place where, when I spoke to women's groups, where the issue of violence towards women wouldn't be raised. And there's nowhere in the world, I promise you, where there isn't a problem around domestic violence. And just now, I chair a big group of women parliamentarians from around the Middle East and North Africa. And women's rights are not great in this region. And these women parliamentarians often are really, these are frontline women who are, courageous women trying to improve things for women and children and their communities. But COVID has driven people back indoors, and many of the advances they felt that were in a creeping way that were being made have been lost. And the abuse of women has absolutely escalated in the most incredible way, and it's a shocking story, but and that's true the world over. Yeah. So domestic violence is not confined to any one place or any one class. It used to be, when I was young and I used to go to court, the judges all had this sort of view that somehow it was something that happened amongst the working classes, and that these men would get drunk at the weekend and somehow leather their wives. But actually, you get it in middle-class households too, and you get it amongst the privileged as well as the poor, and often, and sometimes it's about coercive behaviour. Sometimes it's about controlling women by not letting them have money, and everything has to be asked for. And so there are different ways of controlling.
And fundamentally, this is about sort of patriarchy in society. I understand this is your view. Having read two of your books. So in 2018, Eve was framed, building on your earlier 1992, Eve was framed, patriarchy as a virus that lives deep in the body politic, in your book there, which I recommend to all the people tuning in here, because it's great read, both of them.
Well, if you're going to give me an advert for that book, I'm going to say it's come out in paperback, and they've given it a new title of Misjustice. Yeah, because my original book was Eve was framed, and Eve was shamed is a completely new version of it, but lots of people thought it was just a republication of the old book, and so they retitled it in paperback. And so it is worth having a look, and it's not very expensive, but it does tell the story of law's failure to women, and it's, I hope, very accessible. It's not a law book.
Because when I read those, it's about law, but there's so many parallels in all the professions, including our own, that it really is very valuable to think about that. What else was I going to talk about? I guess back to more about domestic violence and how that was affected by lockdown. Obviously, that was a difficult time, and we know that things escalated beyond belief. And that'll be, I guess, different parts of the world have different ways of managing COVID and still have. So I guess my question is around, therefore, that'll have an impact in the way the rise or not in DVA around the world. But I don't know quite what we can do about that. I mean, it worries me that also after this pandemic, if we understand that financial independence enables women to make choices and not accept abusive relationships, then things are going to be tough, because the economy, our own economy, is going to be struggling. Everybody's economy is going to be struggling. So things are going to get worse.
There's a general feeling that if not well handled, there could be a very real step back for women and the advancement of women's rights and so on, and the journey towards equality will be set back if we don't, handle the whole aftermath well enough. And so I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that, as a lawyer, of course, I started my life as a civil liberties lawyer. I am very concerned that what, of course, governments had to do, and they had to do it, was they had to say some of those fundamental rights that are important to a democracy. I mean, totalitarian regimes don't care about this, but important to democracy is freedom of association, freedom to protest, freedom of movement. Those things are fundamental in democracies and so forth. And what had to happen was that we had to be told to stay indoors, not to be associating, and so on. They could be fined if you did. And so the law had to, be turned in many ways on its head about some of the things that, particularly in the United Kingdom, that we cherish and that we have led the world in saying that the rule of law means those things. However, and we brought in law, and let me tell you, some of the less liberal societies used it as an opportunity to roll back on many of the important advances that had been made, and so they stopped all protests. They said to people, come out of your door and you'll be shot, not that you'll be arrested and given a fine. And so it has been retrograde on many fronts to do with law. And if you look around the world, the opportunities that have been taken in this period, China in relation to Hong Kong, but also hoping that nobody will notice the bad things that are going on in places, that we've had just so many horror stories. I mean, I was involved in the Khashoggi case of his murder, and I went out with the United Nations team as their expert lawyer in this field, and listened to the tapes and so on of his murder. Now, that was pre-COVID, but of course there's been no proper investigations or anything by the UN, partly because travel became impossible, the restrictions on so many of these things became very difficult. So lots of bad things can happen at this time. In the period afterwards, I hope we will have a reassertion of the importance of law and of civil liberties and human rights. I hope that we will start somehow rebuilding in a way that kind of, if you like, shrinks the distance between the rich and the poor, because many people, even in the time of COVID, became even more rich. Yeah. And I do think fair societies have to have we're not here talking about people, running around in Mao suits and all being the same, but we are talking about that gap is becoming too big, and it creates very real pain for people at the bottom end of societies. And so I think that we have to rethink things creatively in the aftermath. And I hope that in this, the position of women will be consciously considered. Now, I want to pay a tribute to people who are oral surgeons, because there's nothing more wretched, as you know, than oral ill health, but also on the many different ways that I've been helped as an international human rights lawyer by oral surgeons, or people in your field one way or another. I'm married to an oral maxillofacial surgeon, as many of you might know, but also by people in the dentistry field and so on. I've done cases where we've had to, have our people who have been tortured, and where we're putting together the evidence on that, to have them seen where they've just had teeth pulled out, and where good oral surgeons can look at a mouth and say, there's no indication that there was any decay here or anything. It would be very strange. And the nature of how they've been removed is suggestive of punishment and not dentistry being done in the ordinary way. Because, of course, the question would be, well, if someone had a bad tooth, then of course you would remove it. But the way in which a tooth has been removed, the tearing of the gums, the way in which these things have been experienced, then a good oral surgeon can often know. And I've been assisted in cases. And so I just want to pay tribute to there are many ways in which, from the most ordinary way of looking after the teeth of our children through to, and the other thing that I wanted to mention was that Ian, my husband, of course, has been very involved in mouth cancer. And he says, you know, the people at the front line in identifying things going wrong in the mouth are often the dentist who's treating someone, and so it's really important, the roles that people involved in oral surgery, dentistry, oral maxillofacial surgery, the work that's being done, because there's nothing more traumatizing for people than having things going wrong in their faces.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. That's very kind. We're nearly out of time, but I want to go back and ask a few more things that are on my list that I need to ask. Back about the Royal College and the advice and recommendation that report's going to give. That's got some relevance to our own organisation, particularly around what we call SAS grades. So people who are staff grades, associate specialist surgeons. I want to talk a little bit about the blocks that there are in careers and on the journey, and that's been an issue that you've highlighted in that report as well. An expectation of an action plan that will become deliverable in a year's time. So there's that. But also just generally, particularly with clinical academic careers, there's a real problem for people making progression, and often just people stop off on the way. And it's interesting. There's been a recent report for NIHR about clinical academics. I just want to read some of the lines. Obviously, it highlights the difficulty of doing clinical stuff alongside academia and the challenges of that, but also that women were subjected to biases related to their reproductive decision-making. That created anxiety in the struggle to continue. Also for gay men who were subjected to discrimination that was so severe that impacted on their choice of specialty. This is across broader medicine, including dentistry. So there are all sorts of barriers on the way still, and the way people are obliged to make their choices, but there aren't really choices. I mean, are there any ways of, I don't know, how do we unblock those?
Well, one of the people I was given a great independence in doing this. Neil Mortensen, the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, to his great credit, and I think it was a real sign of leadership, he saw that there was a problem. He was elected, and then around him, all the other people were men like himself, and he said, we have to have a look at this. And so he invited me to lead this investigation and review. And I put together a panel, and he said, you can do whatever you want in that, and you can make the selections. And I did a lot of research around the place, and I basically went high, and I went down to the juniors, and I went sideways, and I brought in as many different people as possible. But one of the people who was on the panel, my advisory panel, was an SAS oral surgeon. And it was very important because the insights that gave us, and then we had a special session of hearing from SAS surgeons, not all of whom were oral surgeons, but a number of them were. But we heard from people about the ways in which the entry points were somehow blocked. The ways through were not oiled for them, and really in a way that could blight people's opportunities. That's a loss. That's a loss to the the profession. And so I have to tell you, I was quite shocked at the experiences and the descriptions that I had from some of the SAS surgeons about how undervalued they are, about a feeling that they're somehow lesser. And that was of great concern to me. And I included it in the report, and I made an injunction that there had to be something done about this, and in short order. And I really want to see that. One of the things I was also saying, And I was challenged, of course, when I went in front of the council, that when I was doing an interim report, and they said, aren't you stepping outside of your remit, your terms of reference? And I said, listen, if you want to change the leadership inside the Royal College of Surgeons, you have to look at how do people come in? How do people come in and make the journey up through the ranks? What are the things that stop people putting themselves forward or joining in at the different levels in the, in the teaching or examination end of things, or in mentoring? Or why is it that people, the participation of people from ethnic minorities or of women or of people from, for example, from different class backgrounds, why is there such a dearth of people from that variation? And I had to look at what were the handicaps. Where were the ceilings? Where were the blockages? Where were the cul-de-sacs? And they have to be opened up. And the Royal College is an extraordinary institution and a really great institution. But if it's going to move successfully into the 21st century and thrive, it has to draw on all that talent. And that talent takes different forms. And, look at the business of COVID. Look at, the work. I know there's controversy just now about the AstraZeneca thing, but look at the work that was done. Look at the people who appear on our television screens as the epidemiologists, the people who are the scientists with expertise. So many of them are from ethnic minorities. Look at the Pfizer that was, it was immigrant Turkish scientists in Germany who discovered and invented that vaccine. So the role of immigrants coming into our communities, first and second generations, and the extraordinary creativity, cleverness, inventiveness, brilliance. And that has been true of all of our professions, from Jewish immigration through the immigration of people from Eastern Europe, of people from, Africa, India, Pakistan. We've got to recognize the great richness that comes from that. South African dentists, Australians, it all is good.
I've got one final question, which is, I've actually got a black dental student who published a paper with his tutor recently in the British Dental Journal about his experience. It was very interesting because this is just a question about even before you get into the profession, because he was highlighting the difficulties because there were so few role models. There weren't black dentists going into the school and giving the talks or helping with the application process. So that cycle is quite difficult to sort of break unless you've got role models from different backgrounds to encourage that. So that's a step back, isn't it, before you even get there, let alone the barriers beyond that. Have you got any comments on I guess, is that going to
well, can I tell you,
make it happen?
But Paul, it's exactly the same. Where what we realized at the bar was that if there were sets of chambers where there were no black barristers or barristers, who were from the South Asia or wherever, if we didn't have women in commercial chambers, people didn't apply because they think, well, it's obvious that they don't want people like me. So you need those role models, and you need people to be going out to the schools and so on, who are, it puts a terrible burden on the black dentists, but you do need to get that message out there.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. So, Baroness Helena Kennedy, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. It's not quite over, because I'm sure Rian may have one or two questions that will just a few minutes, if that's okay, and then we'll finally thank you and say good night. So Rian, are there any questions that have come through that we can?
Oh yes, they've been coming in thick and fast. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating talk, and a lot of comments that we've had rather than questions, but how everything you've said has resonated with the participants. One of the participants has said that she is often asked what she does for a living, and when she says dentist, the comment comes back, or dental nurse. My own experience when I was a trainee, in one of my first posts, my consultant said to me, well, you're female and Welsh, it's a miracle you're not working in Tesco. These sorts of comments I think resonate through a lot of our participants this evening. You've talked a little bit about the barriers to African and African American backgrounds and difficulty in progressing within the specialty. I think some of our participants feel that they have had blocks in getting on in the specialty. I don't know if you've got any advice specifically about how they could potentially overcome these barriers, or any moves that they could make to move on.
Well, I had a quick look down the list of those questions, and quite a number of them, Rianne, as you've said, relate to the fact that there continues to be problems even in your own organization, which actually has a rather good record in relation to, you've had a number of women presidents, you have a number of people from ethnic minorities who are on your council and board and so on, but that there persists still levels of discrimination, and I see the mentions of that. Listen, these things inevitably take time, but they have to be called out. One of the things that I say in my report, and I do urge you to have a look, because these things are common to most of our professions, and it's worth having a look at the work for the Royal College, because you can do a read across and see how it applies, because it isn't good enough when things are said or slights are made against people and they're not challenged by others. And so, it's not like the business of being on a bus, as my son was recently, and watched someone being aggressive and abusive to a young woman who was sitting up at the front, and who, when he intervened and said, "Is this man troubling you?" Suddenly he became the butt of the abuse, and might have suffered the consequences had the bus driver not stepped in. But all I would say is that it's different when you're amongst professionals, but people sometimes they cover it in pretending it's a joke, but they say ugly things to people, whether it's women or people from minorities, and sometimes a combination of both, because you get that intersectionality, that cross, that read across again, where it's if you're a woman who also is black or from an ethnic minority, you often get added stuff. And so I'm afraid it's for all of us to step up and say, cut it out. You can't talk to people like that, or to take them on one side afterwards and say, you may have felt that was a joke, but it really wasn't. And so I think we all have to carry the responsibility for this. You also have to remember that, and this was true, and I had to be very sensitive in dealing with it in the report. The Royal College of Surgeons has had a very distinguished Black president, Lord Ribeiro. It's had a woman, Claire. I'm going to know. I'm having a senior moment, but there has been a black leader, and there has been a president, and there's been a woman president, and all I can tell you is it doesn't make a difference. That's a drop in the ocean. It's about the whole atmosphere of something. Having one woman at the top of something doesn't matter at all, and it really the difference is made when you can shift the culture. Shifting cultures is hard, but we have to do something about it. So fire away with more questions to me.
Well, I've had a question come through on the WhatsApp group regarding concerns regarding tokenism. Do you because it's all very well looking like you're doing, as you just said, you're doing the thing, you're getting the diversity in, but you can't just do it as a token. It has to be a culture change. Is there any way we could sort of promote the diversity, for example, on our own council? We've got a great gender mix on our council, but perhaps diversity wise we don't have enough African, Asian or ethnic minorities. How can we break that barrier and encourage more of those participants to join council?
Well, I think that one of the simple ways to do it is that you put out a word saying, we would love more people to from ethnic minorities to put themselves forward, because it will enrich the leadership of this organization, and it will help us. So please really consider, when the time comes, put yourself forward, that, we want to hear from you. Also, in having events, make special efforts to be inviting people to come in, because I was only yesterday doing a webinar with the directors of the trustees of the Huntington Hunterian Museum at the Royal College. And I have to tell you that there was the board, and there were a number of women, but they were not the surgeons. They were the people who were representing the museum sort of world. And there wasn't a single person from an ethnic minority. And I said, listen, I pointed it out to them. I said, you can't in the modern world, and in a society like ours, be like this. You've got to, and the way to do it is, and they said, are you suggesting there should be quotas? And I said, you don't have to have quotas. The excellence is there. The brilliance is there. I promise you, there are plenty of people out there who are interested in the Hunterian Museum, interested in knowing about the history of medicine or dentistry or whatever. They have the same interests as anybody else. They're not different, but they need to be invited, and they need to feel that there's. And what you can do is that you don't have to have quotas. What you can do is that if you encourage enough people to put themselves forward, then you can be, in making your choices, saying, wouldn't it be great to have some more people from ethnic minorities? And you sort of slightly put your finger on the scales, which in law you're entitled to do, is if people are as good as each other as candidates, you can put your finger on the scales to make sure that you get the diversity, which is going to be good for your organization. So I encourage that, is to make the welcome and the invitation. And I called the report for the Royal College Our Professional Home, the Royal College of Surgeons, Our Professional Home. An organisation which represents a body should always feel like a place where you can go if you need support at a particular time, if you feel that, for example, a complaint's been made against you and you feel that you need support in it. Of course, there's a general medical council, but your professional organisation should be a place which feels warm. And the stories that we heard was that it doesn't feel that way for enough people, and particularly for people who are different.
Yeah, that's true. To come back to the domestic violence aspect, I think we all have concerns that during COVID-19 there will have been more episodes of domestic violence that perhaps we haven't fully understood or appreciated as yet. How can we make it easier to raise safeguarding concerns? I think particularly in primary care. I'm in work at the moment, and part of these things on the board behind me are flow charts about how we contact people. And it's really complicated and difficult. And I wish it wasn't, because it puts another barrier in the way of raising a concern. Any ideas or any comments on that?
Well, I mean, you just have to. I mean, it's still always useful if you know people in your social services department, or even in your, if it's bad enough in your, it's usually better to go to the social services department rather than police at an early stage. Better to know people. For example, the women who run refuges are fantastic, because they of course know everybody. And so if you have the number of a local refuge, even if you're not sending somebody there, just to say, I've just had somebody and I really would like some advice on how I should handle this, and they will give you particular people that you might be able to phone. So that's always a useful thing to do, rather than the kind of horrible business that people are experiencing just now of trying to phone through to, it's like phoning a call center. You just can't get through to anybody at the moment. So it is hard. And of course, women are finding it very hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think we find, we are always concerned that if the abuser attends with the person that's been abused, and perhaps the only silver lining of COVID-19 is our closed door policy now, so the escorts can't attend with somebody. So it's giving you more freedom to speak to somebody. I wonder whether any of our COVID-19 practices may continue going forward because of these unseen benefits that we found.
It's also a position where if someone comes with his wife or partner saying she has language problems, and I should make it the point that minorities, of course, are not just minorities of color, but also people who are coming from other, who are clearly foreign. And so, for example, husbands coming with, their Bulgarian wife and or their Bulgarian partner or girlfriend, and she needs me because I translate. I mean, sometimes the women are trafficked. So, you've got to be mindful of the fact that those excuses of they're needing a translator is often to preserve silence in the face of a professional. So it is difficult. And I think that it's this practice now that, you know, for COVID reasons, they have to stay outside is a rather positive thing.
Yes. And using Google Translate, which does so much.
Yeah. Can I just mention something? I see that someone mentioned how they hated the expression BAME. I hate the expression BAME, and I hated the expression BAME even before the government's new report suggesting it shouldn't be used anymore. Because the thing that I can't bear about it is the way in which it kind of homogenizes everybody, you know, as if people were the same. And the experience of people from West Africa, or, you know, from different parts of Africa, people from the everybody's experiences can be so distinct. You know, people talking about people who are Muslims, you know, a Muslim from the Lebanon will be often very, very different from, I mean, from someone from Pakistan or from Iran, for example. You know, we're talking about worlds apart, and so rolling things all together is insulting, really, and so I don't like it as an expression either. So I'm saying I agree.
Yes.
I think we're going to have to stop there. Do you think we are?
I think so. Only that somebody was concerned.
There are more questions, but our time is up.
Rian's got one last one.
Oh, okay.
Oh, only one participant was worried how you manage with your stress levels, dealing with all inequality and unfairness. How do you manage to keep you cool?
Well, sometimes I just have to have almost a day in bed where I just need to flake out with a novel. So yeah, but
Good.
Thank you for even asking that.
That's okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Rianne.
It was lovely being here.
Thank you, Baroness Helena Kennedy. That was really kind of you to give us an hour of your time. We really appreciate it. Really fascinating time of discussion. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, and thank you to our delegates who I'm sure will have enjoyed this period, and also it's recorded, so there'll be many others who will be able to catch it later. So just to say, please join us for our next event, which is the 20th of May, and that's about patients' expectations of our surgery. And that's going to be a very fascinating talk by Professor Ian Hutchinson, who works at Barts of London with me, but you may better know him as the Chief Executive of Saving Faces, which is a very well-known charity around facial surgery research. And that would be great if you could join us then. Thank you so much.